How is motherhood becoming increasingly out of reach for young women across the UK?
Well, Oxford-educated Lottie Moore says she earns more than £60,000 a year, but is still worried about starting a family because of Britain's cost of living crisis. She's called on the government to incentivise couples to start families through affordable housing and encouraging working from home. Now, this comes as Kemi Badenoch was criticised earlier this week for describing maternity pay as going too far, although I think she probably misspoke.
Well, it's an interesting discussion and we are going to dive straight into it. Delighted to be joined live in the studio by Lottie herself. Lottie, what made you write this article?
Yeah, so it's a conversation I've been having with lots of people, lots of women my age, that we feel that at the time in which we might be thinking about having children, motherhood is still out of reach. And I think that's down to a lot of factors. I think housing is a big one, the cost of living crisis, the fact that so many of us spend so much of our income on rent. And basically, at the time at which my parents were thinking about having children in their early 20s, 30 years ago, that is now not an option for women. And that, you know, essentially we will be timed out. Yeah. And we also have a birth rate crisis.
Exactly. And your piece is incredibly moving because you're talking about something that is not just buying a house or buying a car that's a kind of nice to have, but something that's really fundamental to the human experience. And we know that most women do want to have children, they want 2.4 children, and yet economic circumstances are actually robbing people of that opportunity. So what can the government do?
So I think we firstly need to look at housing. And we also need to incentivise, we need a government which prioritises the family and the institution of the family. The current government's offering is basically to provide low-cost childcare. Women don't want to necessarily go straight back to work as soon as they have a child. They want to spend time with that child. And I don't think that this government values the institution of the family and family values.
It is fascinating. I keep thinking back to my grandparents who, by the time they were my age, had all of their children. My parents, my mother, by the time she was my age, had 2 children. It is extraordinary that we sort of seem more infantilised as time goes forward. Yes. The sort of people who are in their late 20s are almost the equivalent of people who were in their late teens many decades ago. Is that just to do with housing, or is there some sort of societal shift that's happened?
I think that there is a culture of risk aversion among young people today that wasn't necessarily there. Yeah. You know, I think having kids used to be a process that you just get on with, and I don't think now that is the same. Everything has to be perfect. You have to be able to afford all the mini Bowden and the, you know, all the trappings in order to have children. I also think, you know, you're taught to do the responsible thing, which is not rely on the state, not just have a baby at 19 and expect the government to look after it for you. But there's no policies that incentivise families and a parent that wants to stay at home. If they choose to do that, there's no option for that. So I think that that's kind of where it comes from.
I mean, certainly, you know, what you're saying is very much what I've heard from other women your age. But is it just about women and the economic circumstances? What do men think about this? Are men as ready to settle down and have children as they used to be, or is that a factor that has changed as well?
I think that's a very good question. And I think a lot of my male friends would say that they're also not in the same position. They can't provide in the way that they might want to because they're also living in rented accommodation. They haven't got the income to support a family. And I think it is a crisis maybe that, you know, traditional family values and traditional gender roles, which are not a bad thing, in this sort of new liberal feminist age, everyone has to kind of, women have to work and basically be more like men, and men have to be more like women, and we should all just be androgynous.
And that's not a good way to produce children.
No, it's not. It's definitely
to turn
not.
back to the issue of housing, it is fascinating the proportion of people who share rented accommodation. It's not just renting accommodation, it's sharing with friends, which is, it's lovely to share with friends, but people are doing it well into their 30s now, and the proportion of people who've been doing that has been growing and growing and growing. I mean, fundamentally, why do you think it is that the Conservative government over the last 14 years has allowed such an unconservative thing to take place?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think also, you know, I know a couple who still have a flatmate and they've just had a baby because they can't afford to live on their own. I do think that if you want to have a child, you need to have a stable base for that child. I think that's right. But, you know, 46% of income generally goes on rent. It's very difficult to get a mortgage. So we're in this bind. You know, lots of people have said to me, oh, well, you know, after the article, oh, well, if you just move out of London, you know, you can afford a house, stop buying oat lattes and
But then you wouldn't have a job.
Yeah, then I wouldn't have a job.
Exactly.
My work is here. And also, you know, my support network is here. It takes a village. My support network is here. So why should I have to make that choice?
One of the attitudes that seems to have changed over recent years is that, you know, having children used to be seen as an incredibly natural thing and a contribution to society. Now when you have these discussions, people say, oh, it's such a selfish thing to have a child. Where do you think that's come from?
Having a child is almost like buying a Lamborghini.
Or luxury.
It's a luxury. It's not. We don't see children as a public good. Fertility is seen as a luxury, rather than something that we need to nurture and protect.
And looking around the world, you can see the sort of stagnation in societies that don't have enough children. These fast-growing East Asian countries, South Korea, Japan, that in the 80s looked like they were sort of taking over the world and have now fallen into decline because the number of people living in these countries is falling. I mean, there's an economic imperative here. If we want to fund the NHS, if we want to fund pensions, we need more people.
Yes, exactly.
How much do you think, it's obviously economics is a really important factor, but how much do you think kind of women's career ambition plays into this? Because often what you hear from the government is, you know, that we need more free childcare so we can get straight back to work. But, you know, do you think that is a big factor in it, or do you think it's just that...
So I think if you actually ask women what they want, and I know there's an organisation called The Other Half that's just produced a report on this where they actually asked women what they want, asked mothers what they want. It is not to go back to work straight away. It is to spend more time. Women want to be with their babies when they have children. I think this idea that liberal feminism has taught us is that you can have it all, that having a career is the only option, and actually once you have your amazing career and you have your baby, you can just pay a nanny to look after it. And that is not what women want. That's not good for children, it's not good for women, and it's not good for families. And I just think that the narrative, particularly that I've grown up with in the last 10 years, has been incredibly skewed towards me having a career and having it all. And it's only really dawned on all of us in the last couple of years that we can't do that.
Yeah. Do you think, we did some polling on this last year when I was an MP and found that a lot of women just don't have a proper biological understanding of fertility. I think 2/3 of women thought that modern technology could mean you could have a baby at any age. Do you think there is some misinformation here, if you like?
I do, and I think it's really dangerous. I've got a friend who's in a corporate law firm. Basically, you know, work like a dog in your 30s when you're still relatively cheap for us.
Yes.
And you work really, really hard, and then, you know, we'll pay for you to have a baby. We'll pay for you to freeze your eggs. That's an incredibly invasive, quite unsuccessful process, and it's selling women a lie. And surrogacy is the other I think really dangerous sort of idea that you can have a child by surrogacy if you pass the point at which your body can have them. I think that we need to have a realistic, proper understanding and conversation about the limits at which women can have children and help them to do that.
And the ethics surrounding that as well.
Exactly, yeah.
No, it's fascinating. I've always been fascinated with this idea that people who, if you look at people in their, you know, even late teens from the 1950s, they look older. They look physically older. They look more mature. They've got their lives together. People are early.
Had more experiences.
People in their early 30s don't have their lives together now.
Well, it doesn't help if you don't have your first job till you're 22, does it? I mean, that is a big change.
Well, Lottie, thank you so much for coming in and talking through your experiences.